In this video, I want to talk about pivot charts, which are essentially is a feature of Excel which allows us to summarize large amounts of data quickly in an interactive way similar to a pivot table. Actually, in order to create a pivot chart, you have to create a pivot table. The charting functionality is just one more feature on top of the standard pivot table. What are the features? Well, again, pivot tables and charts are all about summarizing large or even just small complicated data in a much easier way to understand what's going on inside the data. We have standard pivot table options such as count, sums, averages, and many more functions that we can use. And the one thing about the pivot charts is it's somewhat limited. For example, we can select a standard column chart or a pie chart, but we can't actually utilize an XY scatter or a few other ones to mention. So let's talk a little bit about the tasks at hand. We have a data set collected from Forbes.com, basically listing out the top 500 American CEOs based on their 2008 salary. Our objective is to analyze this data by developing pivot charts. So let's go ahead and start this learning activity by opening up the file. Okay, when we open up the file, we can see it's a rather large data set. We have industry, which would be a good column to use in terms of the summary that we're going to develop. Of course, we have the information about the CEO, the gender, male or female. We have the company name, the ticker, and various other information such as years as the CEO, years with the company, the age, and so forth. The interesting data is here, total compensation, which is in terms of the salary, bonus, and other payment made. And then finally, the 2008 stock gain. So all of these combined, these four columns combined, accounts for the total 2008 compensation. There are some extra numbers here: 5-year compensation total, shares owned, 6-year annual return, and so forth. But basically, the data I'm interested in is right here, along with the industry name. So to create a chart, I would recommend going to the Insert. There's a little drop-down arrow here, which allows us to select a pivot chart. You can just create a pivot table first, and then there is also a pivot chart option inside of a pivot table. But I want to go ahead and just start with a pivot chart. And since I had this selected, it thinks I want that as my range. I do not. So I'm going to highlight the entire range A1 to, I got to make sure I get the bottom. So it'll essentially be this list, A1 through W501. I'm going to hit OK, and that's going to create a new worksheet. This actually is the pivot table, and they put the pivot chart on here just as the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this pivot table. And essentially what I'm going to do later is actually move this chart. So let's think of things that we can summarize. The first thing that comes to my mind is the industry. So let's put that as a row label. And I'm interested in their salary. So let's either graph the total compensation, or what I thought would be interesting is to actually take all four of the components of the salary and add those into our pivot table. So let's go ahead and hit salary as a value. We don't want to count. We want an average. How about bonus? And again, we want an average. Other. And we want an average. And let's say stock gains. And again, an average. So we have all of these averages graphed here in the pivot chart. What I think is a better idea is actually moving this chart to its own tab. So I'm going to right click on it and say move the chart to its own sheet, and I'm going to call it pivot chart in this case, and hit enter. When you're dealing with larger data sets like this, it's usually a good idea to move this legend so we have a little bit more of the white space. I would recommend going to Layout, Legend, and show that at the bottom to give us some more room. The other thing we could do is, since these are components of salary, rather than listing this as an individual clustered column, why don't we change the design? So let's go to Design, Change Chart Type, and actually change it to a stacked. Let's hit OK. So now this is a cumulative sum, if you will, of the average salary per CEO per industry. Okay, the functions and features that you would expect with a chart are here. If we wanted to change colors, for example, we have our standard palette. I tend to use this one quite a bit with the white lines, but if we wanted grayscale, we could hit that and so forth. I'm going to leave it on the default, the one below the default actually. We have different layouts. If we wanted some other information here with legends and things like that, we can use the default ones. We can create our own in terms of the legends that we want to display or the axis. I'm going to go ahead and apply a vertical axis that is rotated, and I'm going to write total, let's see, average total compensation in terms of millions of dollars. Okay, so we have that listed there. We could do the horizontal one if we wanted to. Horizontal axis below, I'm going to say industry. Okay, so essentially what we're seeing here is the pivot chart. You do see some extra buttons on this. For example, if we wanted to filter and not display all of the industries, we could select a few that we really wanted to analyze. So maybe we want to analyze the aerospace, maybe chemicals, construction. Let's see, how about materials, oil, and perhaps transportation and utility. We could hit that just fine, and it would actually filter the categories so we're only seeing the ones we wanted. So there's this type of graph. If you wanted to create more and more charts, you actually have to create a new pivot table from the original data. So I was thinking about generating another chart. Let's say go back to CEO compensation. And this time I'm not going to make a selection, but rather just select a single cell and go to Insert. And I'll show you this way how to do it if you start from a pivot table first in order to create a pivot chart. I'm going to call this Pivot Table 2. Of course, we could think of better descriptive words than just that if we wanted to. I am going to arrange this as industry and let's say total compensation, an average, and format that as a currency. So number format, currency, no decimal places. Okay. Okay, again. I guess we can show one decimal place that might be useful. Okay, so we have that. I thought it would be interesting to break this down into several graphs and just play around with the options just a little bit. From this table, we could actually create the pivot chart right here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit that. And it'll actually give you a choice versus the other way we did it, which it just defaults to a column. I want to select a pie and hit OK. So the chart is going to exist right next to the pivot table. We can move it like we did last time if we wished to. Let's go ahead and right click and move chart, and I'm just going to call this pivot chart 2 for lack of better words. So we have this breakdown now of our industry with the average salary. It does appear that leader lines could be a good option, and maybe selecting one of these layouts would be a little bit better. Let's say maybe try this one, and rather than seeing the legend, maybe we'd be better off seeing leader lines. So I'm going to go into layout. I'm going to turn off the legend, and then I'm going to turn the data labels on, but I'm going to put them outside, and then right click on the data label and turn on the series, I should say category name, not series. And let's see, we can include the legend key, and I think that's good enough. I'm wondering if best fit might be a little bit better. The problem is we've got so much data here, it's getting harder and harder to graph. Of course, we could filter off some of those industries if we really wanted to, which might not be a bad idea. Okay, in terms of another chart, perhaps we'll start back at the CEO compensation, go to Insert, Pivot Chart, and let's go ahead and create our third pivot table. And maybe we're investigating some sort of differences between males and females. So I'm just going to add some information here to our pivot table, maybe by industry, gender. And the reason why I want to show you this is because it actually is pretty neat how they Excel does this, is that we can have two categories within our chart, and you'll see exactly what I mean in just a second. I'm going to go back to our list here, and perhaps we can play around with something other than total compensation. How about performance versus pay rank? And we want that as a value. And let's say we want the average of that. Okay, right now it's displaying there's actually only a few female CEOs that made the list, only a few here. What I wanted to show you, and I'm going to actually move this chart out so we have more room to work with. I'm going to call this pivot chart 3. Based on the table, let's say our pivot table 3, this might be just fine to summarize this data like this. You might build the table, and the table looks visually appealing, and you get to a situation where you look at the chart, and maybe the chart actually isn't as appealing as it could be. That's where the trial and error process is going to come into play. I would actually recommend changing the gender down here to industry, or to the category, and then change the industry into the legend. That way we get a breakdown, females on one side and males on the other. Of course, we could do the formatting changes where we move the legend to the bottom, but I just thought it was interesting that they broke it down like this. You could change it back, of course, to industry, and as far as the legends, we could split those up. And then of course filter anywhere. But I just thought it was interesting to do that. Of course we could do something like this too, which it gets a little messy, where it breaks down every industry, and then within industries it breaks down male and female. Similarly, like this, we're seeing the female CEOs and then all of the males. But I think probably the better way to do this is probably to put the industry key in the legend, and then gender as the axis. So we have females and males on one side, and it's very clear. Maybe not as clear as it really should be, because it's very difficult to tell where the greens differentiate. For example, is that a business service, diversified financial, or household and personal products, or even the semiconductor industry? I'm not sure. It's hard to match up those greens. So anyway, maybe it would be better to have something like this, where it's well defined.